Right, well, we're going to go on a bit of a journey today around the countryside, and then eventually coming into focus on the area closer to home for most of the people in the room around Melbourne. Glenelg Trust, as was mentioned, is now about 10 years old, and yeah, it's been an interesting journey. We've learnt a lot about working, I guess in some respects, in unconventional ways compared to what people perhaps might be used to, with how this sort of work might have occurred, through, more traditional models and methods of getting work done on the ground. So I think that'll come through in the examples that we share today. In terms of the structure of today, I'm just going to give a quick intro to us. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the tools we use to restore wetlands and the way we see and investigate sites, trying to look at them through a range of different viewpoints and lenses. And I'm hoping then when we get to the part looking around the Melbourne Urban Growth Zone, you'll see how some of those themes either do or don't fit particularly well with the way that we currently go about treating those features in areas that are subject to urban development. So that's the general picture for today. As I mentioned, Glenelg Trust is now 10 years old. Over that time, we have operated in a range of different ways.
In for JP, he's feeling a little bit unwell today. So
we just need someone to mute. Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of the way we work, we are a little bit different to other not-for-profit organisations that you might be familiar with, because we have a deliberately blended business model. And this is to, when you start an organisation from scratch, as we did, this was quite a deliberate decision to make sure that we had flexibility in the ways and means that are available to us to get things done on the ground. So, very quickly, grant-funded project work is great because that's where our professional skills and ideas can be brought to fruition by us coming up with those ideas and applying for funding. We also offer our services as professional consultants, but there is a big caveat on that. We won't just work for anybody, and there's a lot of work that traditional consulting would see as its bread and butter that we don't touch. So we don't go near anything that is facilitating development. So, that really does make us a different type of consultant, if that makes sense. And finally, and perhaps more importantly, in more recent times, we are a deductible gift recipient listed charity and offer people tax deductions for supporting our work. So that's the way we work. And we're very deliberately, we try and work wherever the issues are. So we work in a tenure blind way across the landscape, which means that we're different things to different people in different places, and quite comfortably so. We're a pretty dynamic and flexible group now of about 35 staff working for Glenelg Trust. In terms of one of our overarching goals, it's looking for ways to try and turn restoration science into practice, and the way that we try and do that, and this comes really from many of us who work at Glenelg Trust having come out of the world of government or academia, and seeing that these barriers often exist between people who work in these different parts of our sector, if you want to think of it as a whole. The people doing the research work, the people doing the plans, and the people on the ground. And I'm sure everybody can relate to situations where you can think that these groups aren't talking to each other. And so one of the things that we really try and do is make sure that the work of each of these groups is informing the other. And we dabble in each of these ourselves. It makes for a pretty diverse and interesting workplace. I guess just to kick off as well, as far as background, this is just a small sample of the sites that we've restored that involve, or that we're working to restore wetlands over the last 10 years. These are the ones that are more linked to protected areas or public land. I won't read them all out, but it's just to give you a sense of, even in areas that we think of as being our premier reserved land, they often have inherited a legacy of past modification to their hydrology. This is a reflection of the fact that there was very little land reserved in its pristine state in Australia. Often it went through a phase of being managed for other purposes before it became reserved. And as a result, it means that there are a lot of legacy issues out there that need resolving. And this may surprise some people because they think when they go to reserve that everything's just as it should be, and that nothing may have changed. when you do some digging, you realise there's actually a lot of issues out there, and particularly water-based issues. There's a lot of them out there. The most common reason for this is when people had tried to improve the production capacity of land for grazing, and they made modifications to drainage, and those issues carry over. The vegetation shifts. Things look like they're all just in a new balance, and in a sense they are, but quite often there are underlying issues that may still need to be addressed. So we've been addressing these gradually across the landscape, and there are plenty more to go given the level of modification to wetlands in southeastern Australia. So I mentioned the why. We'll keep going. So in terms of giving you a bit of a taste of the tools that we use to look at restoring wetlands, I thought we'd just go for a quick buzz around different parts of southeastern Australia to show you some examples, both in terms of example sites and also the types of resources and tools that we use to inform the work. So this map is I think it's an 1880s map of a place called Rowan Swamp, which is just north of Benalla in Yorta Yorta country. And if you have a close look at the outlet, that image there from 1883 of the survey plan, and then look at the present day LiDAR imagery, which shows a fairly deeply eroded outlet that extends into the wetland basin. Things that we will do is, as well as looking at the old maps and the modern tools like LiDAR, when you go out on the ground, if you're lucky enough to have long-lived species, in this case, river red gums, there are other ways of triangulating this information to help us understand the story of change. So what you can see there, and anyone who is familiar with red gums, normally they don't grow with their roots above the ground. So this is telling us about an order of change that's occurred at this site. So the red gum is hundreds of years old. It established with the surface level at a particular height. And then that erosion process and that channel you can see there is the one that we've picked up in the modern LiDAR. So sometime in the last 140 years, a whole lot of soil has been washed away out of this environment. And as you go downstream, and you can see that further image in the top right, the depth of that erosion gets to the extent that we have roots that are poking out, up to 1 or 1.5 meters above the bed level of the eroded outlet. So that tells us part of this story of change, and it's a fantastic way of interpreting what we see on maps. In terms of what LiDAR can also show us, and we can get a great picture of the elevation of the ground, which allows us to look at predicting or modelling the inundation impact as areas receive flows, and this site is no different. So that's sort of a raw LiDAR image. We can use that then to scenario test what would happen as you fill a wetland up from empty. And in this case, what we're able to do to try and work out what the original sill level or retention height of water was in this wetland when it was mapped in the 1880s is to correspond those inundation scenarios with the layer that with the map that I showed you previously from the 1880s. So in this case, we worked out that the level of this wetland in the 1880s was about 135.05 meters AHD, which is that scenario in the bottom left, surcharging probably to a level a bit higher than that in the bottom right. Now, the reason that's important is that when it comes to determining both the place of putting a structure to retain water in the wetland to its pre-modification level, and understanding what height to put that at, this information is critical. So that's where we decided that we would propose putting a trial structure, and you can see that it really neatly matches the area that was mapped in the 1880s. So this sort of triangulation of information is a fascinating process. In terms of the trial structure that is now going to be installed, hopefully in the near future at this site, we've got funding and approval to go ahead with that. You can see the design there and the location, the channel, those exposed roots in the foreground. I'm not sure why. I'm sorry, my presentation seems to be automatically changing at the moment. I'll just keep jumping it back. So that's the spot in the channel where we decided is the logical point to put a trial structure in place. This is a method that we've used really commonly across particularly public land sites, because there's often hesitation about making changes on public land where you've got, in many cases, existing residual or remnant vegetation communities that have adjusted to the new hydrological regime. Quite often we're detecting an ongoing ecological impact of that change, and people are understandably nervous about making permanent changes suddenly. So the trial structure method, and given, as you can see with using geofabric sandbags, it's adjustable in real time. So we have fantastic flexibility. It's relatively inexpensive. And it's the sort of thing that we can get community out and about on site to help us, you know, with. And now when you've got people in a local community that have been aware of changes like this over, in some cases, waiting for change in terms of fixing some of these issues over decades, this is a really therapeutic process for people to be a part of. So no surprises that you see lots of people in those images, because we don't usually have too much trouble having people come out and be part of these projects. And there's been a number of these that have now transitioned to permanent works, as you'll see in an example in a moment. So well, let's go to the southwest of Victoria now, down in the Discovery Bay coast, a place called Long Swamp. This has been a long-term project over almost a decade for Glenelg Trust. And this is a site where we can have a think about understanding those shifts in wetland vegetation that occur in response to changing hydrological conditions. So when you see that image, I'm gathering that you'll probably see what looks like a really nice area of wetland habitat. And you'd be right, but you're also looking at a site that is showing signs of being in transition and going through a drying trend of change. And that sign is the shrub invasion that you can see there that's happening. Now that's a wetland shrub, but it's normally an edge species rather than something that would be growing through the bed or the deeper areas of a wetland. If you're not alert to this when you go and visit a site, you see what looks like nice wetland habitat. We'll explain a bit later why this is one of the mistakes that often gets made in snapshot visits to wetlands, that runs the risk of not seeing this wider picture of change over time. Having taken on board the community's concern about this trend of change, and there was lots of discussion and to and fro with the various agencies, ultimately we gained agreement to run a trial in 2014 and 15 to lift water levels in the wetland. The third phase of that trial really made a big difference to water levels in this part of, it's only a small part of Long Swamp that we affected with a greater change in water level, but it had a major flow-on effect for downstream areas. There's about 11 kilometres of wetlands between this place called Nobles Rocks and the Glenelg River estuary. And that chain of wetlands had been starved of the flows from this area as a result of that cutting to the ocean. After that third phase of the trial in 2015, you can see the immediate change in retention levels upstream, recreating a feature that had previously been called Bully Lake. Now, after that trial phase, and as people became comfortable with the results and the ecological trends that we were detecting, this project shifted quite quickly to a phase of permanent works. And the thing that I like about showing you this as an example is that it really highlights our philosophy of works, which is very different. And I guess if we go back 15 years ago, the local CMA did get engineering advice at this site about ways that they could go ahead with trying to restore this wetland. And if there are any engineers in the room, I don't wish to offend you, but one of the challenges of going to an engineer for that type of advice is they'll come back to you with designs for concrete structures and boards and weirs and things that are very much focused around built infrastructure. Our objective with a lot of these works, particularly in sensitive areas, in the middle of, in this case, a state reserve and now a Ramsar site, is that we would rather minimise the amount of built infrastructure. Now, the benefit of going about restoring the site in the trial phase and then leaving that in place, in this case, the geofabric core effectively of a brand new sand dune, we built the sand dune around it, pumping slurry off the beach and shaping it up. And it's only 3 years later, and have a look at how the site now looks in terms of transition. So parks are really happy with this because they'll end up with a wetland that's been restored and no asset on the asset register that needs to be maintained. You know, the flow-on effects of this for everybody are really positive. And our objective is when we take people out there down the track, and hopefully 5 or 10 years time, people will say, what drain, you know, where was the cutting? No evidence of that change that occurred in this case in the 1930s when a deliberate cutting was made at this location. Now, going back to that earlier image of showing what happens upstream, So this is a very similar view to the one I showed you earlier, where we have a gauging point and a data logger. Have a look at what happens as water levels rose. So this is just as the main phase of the trial was beginning in 2015. A few months later, as water levels rose behind the structure, you can see we're up to 43 centimetres. After a little bit more tweaking, and a couple of years later, water levels have stabilised closer to, at this location, closer to 57 centimetres deep. And if you have a close look, and I'll go back, have a look at the vegetation change that has taken place. So the shrubs have very much moved back upslope and have moved out of this zone, and we've had recovery of the rushes and sedges in this area, which is the type of communities that we're losing in areas that are terrestrialising or drying out. Now, let's go further around the coast. This is across the border into South Australia, a place called Tilley Swamp, which is at the southern end of the Coorong, actually. This is a place where historically flows used to enter the southern lagoon of the Coorong. I'm just using this as an example of a place where there had been some discussion about how regularly flows entered the Coorong, or even if they did it all through Salt Creek. The people who are asking those questions haven't gone back and read the old journal articles and accounts, the old newspaper accounts, the things that exist. These are not published data sources that we consider as reliable as modern scientific literature. We understand that, but when you're trying to piece together the history of a site, these are the tools that are available to us to understand what was going on. I won't read that out for you, but this very much paints the picture of a site that in the right year at the right time, these are places that, this was a place that had massive flows coming from the southeast region of South Australia into the Coorong, very much, supporting what the locals had always known and said, which is that, of course, there were flows when the southeast got really wet. But it's amazing how that memory gets lost over time, particularly as we've made modifications to that landscape. And now when you go to these places, it's very hard to picture some of these things occurring in the way that they used to. Another thing that is really great to look at is old survey maps, which, in this case and in a lot of parts of this part of South Australia, the early surveyors made fantastic notations on there about vegetation, where water courses and water bodies were. Again, I won't read it, but you can see the notations there about. In this case, it was a very open, wet flat. Just with, if you read the last sentence there, mostly covered with cutting grass with patches of tea tree. Now, it was a very open, flat, very wet environment. The reason that's relevant is if we now fast forward 100 years later, after, in this case, including quite recently, government endorsed deep drainage programs have gone through these environments, and building on earlier change, continuing a drying trend. So when you take the water out of these environments, well, what happens? Well, not surprisingly, you get this terrestrialization process occurs. So where there used to be open basins that would hold water for long enough to resist invasion by shrubs, and you can see the new drain alignment there passing through that basin. It was only a short number of years later, and you see these mass recruitment events of, in this case, saltwater paperbark, Melaleuca halmatuorum, which is completely displacing what were previously more open aquatic habitats. Hydrology drives all these changes. It's very logical when you stop and think it through, but if you go there and visit that site and don't understand that trajectory of change, you run the risk of not seeing the true picture. And these final images show that that process can go so far as to even result in coastal dryland species invading formerly wet flats. So not just wetland species that would normally grow on the edge moving down, but in this case, that's coastal bearded heath and coastal wattle coming out of the dunes and literally invading the wet flats. So in this case, the terrestrialization process was approaching completion, if you like. However, as a result of some fantastic work by a number of different organisations and a project led by the state government, we were proud to support in a few different ways. We've managed to work collaboratively, including with private landowners in the former Tilley Swamp, to go from a situation where prior to 2018, that area in blue at the top was all that remained of that former wetland stretch. And as a result of that project, that's the area now that can hypothetically inundate when flows are available, which is a huge increase in area. And to give you some idea of scale, that's over 6,000 hectares, that total area. So this is quite a significant restoration project. Next example is a place called Mount Burr Swamp. This is actually a Nature Glenelg Trust reserve. So I didn't mention it earlier, but in terms of the pathways for restoring sites, our preferred scenario is to work with other land managers on their land. That's the absolute preferred scenario, because we recognise that there's no point trying to buy or own everything, particularly when you're working in a highly developed agricultural landscape as we are. That said, there are a handful of sites that have come up that are at what I would call a fork in the road. There's a strategic moment where you know, if we could find a way to secure a site, you could take it down a different path to where it would otherwise end up. In this case, you know, a future of more intensive agricultural use. And at sites that are in particularly special locations, in this case, this is next to the second most floristically diverse reserve in South Australia, a wetland reserve called Marshes Native Forest Reserve to the south. It's really the only direction that reserve could ever have been expanded. And in this case, despite the previous landowners being sympathetic, they weren't in a position just to give the land away. So you've got this tension of they needed to be paid an agricultural rate for this land, and it was very much at that fork in the road. So that's a scenario that's repeated itself a few times over the years, and we've been fortunate enough to be able to collect a group of like-minded individuals, organisations and others to piece together a way of funding the purchase of a few areas like this. So Nature Glenelg Trust now owns and manages, if you go to our website, you'll see there's 8 areas that are similar to this, or at least represent different parts of a restoration or environmental management story. And we use them as demonstration sites, as well as achieving on-ground outcomes. So you'll see there, this site's been highly modified. At the bottom, you've got the purple lines are artificial drains, which drain the dozens of wetland features. And when we purchased the property, especially given that we did public fundraising, we were able to make a really quick start on this one, which was great. So the artificial outlet drain from the main swamp, we were able to get a team of volunteers out and we sandbagged it in half a day. And the change in what you see on the ground after doing something like that is pretty dramatic. So this is an image from the year before, and you'll see the network of drains through the swamp. This is an image a couple of months after the sandbags went in a year later, showing how much water we were able to retain in this wetland. Now, this is getting better over time, this wetland, but even in the first year, we had an explosion in growling grass frog breeding at this site. Nationally threatened fish have recovered in this wetland. We've got little galaxis at this site. Beyond threatened species, even though there are several of them, a whole host of wildlife has, you know, water birds in particular are very adept at finding water in the landscape. So it doesn't take long to have this process of recovery unfold once we put the water back in the landscape. After all, wetlands are inherently dynamic. So there's a great possibility there that we can tap into in restoring sites. Another site that Nature Glenelg Trust owns at Walker Swamp, which is a particularly spectacular site. It's in the southern Grampians. Just to give you a bit of a feel for the nature of the country out there. Now, we'd done restoration trials and then permanent works to fix 2 wetlands over the property boundary in the national park next door, Gooseneck Swamp and Brady Swamp. In the process of doing that, we got to know about this property, and it took 4 or 5 years, but ultimately we were able to piece together a way of purchasing this property. It's 1,000 acres, and you'll see there that across that 1,000 acres, there was over 20 kilometres of drains, levee banks, and various changes made to hydrology. Before we proceeded with works, and thanks to support from the local Glenelg Copkins CMA with a range of elements with this project, including the land purchase, we also did a hydrological investigation to work out how we would set the site up to work with flows. And without explaining all of the features there, the key ones are that we retained a levee bank at number 2 and 3 there, and a spillway at number 4, which allowed us to retain water to our target height in the chain of wetlands without impacting our neighbours, which is a really important consideration. there is still farmland to the west of the northern part of the property. But this property had a lot of issues. After a long period of grazing and drainage, it had then gone through a change in land use to blue gum plantation establishment, which ironically was also a change in land use that created the opportunity for us to come in and purchase the site at a lower price than would have been possible if it had remained in its more agriculturally improved state, if you take my point with that. So being at the fork in the road is one thing for certain properties, and this is one of them. It was a key moment in time as well, that if that moment had passed, this property would now probably be worth, you know, it's a totally different proposition to think about purchasing a property if someone's invested in renovating pastures and removing the blue gum stumps. We've still had to deal with that legacy, but we've done it in a way that fits with our cost profile and the fact that we're not necessarily going to have to establish pasture or till this ground. So we've just been poisoning the stumps, as you can see there, or in a few patches, plucking the trees out, and in other areas, actually harvesting the trees and then spraying them to try and cover our costs. In the wetland beds themselves, where the blue gums failed, which you know, were still artificially drained and would dry out very quickly, but just too soppy for the blue gums to establish. They tried to plant the whole property, unfortunately. The incentives were there in that industry for people to be paid per area ripped, per trees in the ground, and they all got paid irrespective of whether those trees survived. So we've done a whole lot of remedial work to literally level off the surface of those furrows and mounds. And then a trial that we put in place at this site, which you can see bottom left, again with volunteer help and with the consent of the previous owners, because that just affected the deepest areas of Walker Swamp. And they are areas where the blue gums had already failed, but you see how low the level of that structure is compared to now that we've literally backfilled that drain, and you'll see the blue gums now missing in the background. So, you know, this is a case where we're able to try a certain level of restoration under the previous land use for a few years, but to get the full restoration effect, we really needed to backfill the drains completely. And this is the point now downstream of that spot that you were just looking at before, where we set up a spillway, in this case involving volunteers and sandbags again, with the expectation that eventually we will we'll cover it with a small amount of earth. And you can see here the process as we've backfilled the drains upstream, set this up as a spillway, and then in 2019 we had a partial filling event. But the main event was in 2020 when the whole system filled and everything worked exactly as we hoped, which was fantastic after all those works. And as you'll see again here, this is a set and forget solution. So much more inexpensive, no concrete, no gates and weirs, nothing that can be sabotaged. And once we've adjusted the levels to where we want them as we did that year, with adding an extra layer of sandbags to get the levels just right, we can lightly top that with soil at some point, and that will grass over, and that will be our solution for the time being with this site, and we don't have to touch it. Nature looks after it from here. We have the benefit with this site of being able to see what Walker Swamp looked like during the first aerial photography in the 1940s, and we can then obviously track its demise. You'll see the drains through the wetland and the blue gums that have been attempted to be established there throughout the site. It was at its lowest ebb up until 2014. With the trial structure in place, that's the area that we were impacting for 4 years with the consent of the previous owners. And then in 2019, that first year we had a partial filling, and you can see there the northern basin has reappeared as a result of backfilling the drains through the whole site. But the really impressive one, which hopefully isn't blocked by the faces, is what happened in 2020 when the whole chain of wetlands down the eastern side of the property, and you can see the effect of the two levee banks there, how they're holding water back from spilling through the neighbours. And but we used the level that we set the spillway at based on the low point where that connection would take place a little bit further to the west. So this is set up basically at the original full supply level, but we've had to make the control point a different location to achieve the same result. And other tools we can use to look at how a site's behaving and also our impact on a site things like the Landsat data, which goes back for a few decades and is now being used for water detection, you can see how the site was behaving in its drain state. There's an example image from 2011. You can see how it was behaving with the trial structure in place, and then you can see the effect of full restoration. So there are some fantastic different, again, this idea of triangulating different data sources. Now, this applies both to the planning phase of a project, when you're trying to work out how to calibrate your approach and what the target level is for a site, but also when it comes to monitoring and understanding the effect of what you've done after the fact. And in terms of what that looks like on the ground, it's a pretty spectacular part of the world. If you are interested to come and have a look, just feel free to grab my details at the end of the talk, and we can let you know how to go out there and have a look at some point. But it's a pretty special part of the world, the Grampians there in the background. Right, so another example, this is on the Fleurieu Peninsula, just south of Adelaide, near a place called Mount Compass, where in this case, trying to re-engage old flow paths, which you can see with the trial structure there to the bottom left, which we hope to revert to permanent works in the next year or so, and also backfilling of drains to bring groundwater back to the surface, which you can see in the chain of images to the right. This is highly effective at getting water to recontact the surface and to create the right kind of, in this case, this is a peat swamp, even though that section's sandy. As you go to the right, it becomes a peat swamp. Retaining moisture in the substrate is a key part of the hydrological regime of these communities. And a way to think about the effect of drainage now this is both relevant to wetlands and in watercourses, but this image is from the Malone Institute, who do a lot of work in waterways. It illustrates the effect that we're keen to share with you, which is that whether it's through erosion or through the construction of artificial drains, when you dewater the soil profile beneath a wetland or an alluvial soil, you completely change its capacity to retain and hold soil/groundwater, and therefore there's this chain reaction in terms of the biotic processes going on the natural surface either side of that zone. Now, this is happening, forget about wetlands for a moment, this process is happening across just about every eroded watercourse up and down all across this country. Like when you drive around where you see deeply incised eroded waterways down river valleys, this process is happening. And it's crazy when you think about, we're in a dry continent, and when we do have rainfall, it's flashy often, as we've been seeing this year, and we've created a landscape that doesn't retain water, which is just, it doesn't make sense. So this is a really important take-home message from thinking about today's talk and where we can fix our landscape. There's a lot that can be done in this space, both in lowlands where you've got flat country and wetlands that have been drained through artificial drainage, but also in sloped and incised river valleys where we've created erosion gullies that are stripping the water out of our alluvial soils. The same general principles apply. Final example, we've started work on a project down adjacent to Moulting Lagoon in Tassie, and yeah, in this case, removing levee banks that were constructed by convicts a couple of hundred years ago that have been affecting inundation patterns in really important areas of salt marsh. So this is another one of these situations where literally just putting the ground back as it was and allowing floods and tides to inundate the ground in a natural way again, which will allow for seamless transitions of vegetation types, particularly in response to future sea level rise. Right, so we've been on a bit of a buzz all over the countryside to give you a bit of a feel for, there are so many other examples I could give you, but hopefully that gives you a taste of the types of tools and the types of contexts that we find when you go and look at a wetland at any given site. In terms of barriers for sites closer to home for many of you who live in and around Melbourne, I guess the backdrop that we need to be aware of here is that Melbourne's growth is causing a wholesale loss of either existing or modified wetland features all around the periphery of Melbourne. And this has been going on for decades. In some places where it happened many decades ago, we're still dealing with the legacy of this change, with areas that have increased flood risk, You know, particularly if you think about some areas that have, you know, we're now naturalizing areas, for instance, that had previously been concreted and the like, you know, to try and mitigate some of those risks and to re-engage floodplains and billabongs and things like that. So the reason for shining a light on this and talking to you today is that there are areas where we still run the risk of making these mistakes today, despite how well we now understand these issues. And this really is, this is a big deal. Like, it's a big planning, it's a massive planning issue for Melbourne. So that report from a couple of years ago highlighted where wetlands are either no longer present, at risk, or where there's a future impact predicted. As you'll see in a moment, there are reasons why that may not be a complete picture, but it does at least highlight this issue. So everyone's aware of it, but we're having trouble dealing with it for some of the reasons that we'll talk about now as we go through some of the barriers. I guess just to show you what this looks like first on the ground. This is an example. I just one day went for a bit of a play with Google Earth, you know, and you can find places if you go buzzing around areas that are now urbanized and find features that just don't exist anymore. You know, they're gone. This is one near Craigieburn. And you can see the process of loss there as the area was developed. It's a pretty common theme. So some of the barriers, now these aren't all of them, but I thought we'll go through a series of these to give you a bit of a feel for where the system is breaking down, and there are reasons for why it's breaking down, and it's nobody's fault necessarily, but the point is that we've got to be aware of these issues or we're going to keep making the same mistakes that were made, you know, decades ago. So first example, hopefully you've got a feel for the theme from the earlier examples, that going to a site and just looking at what it looks like now runs the risk. In this case, we're mentioning how you run the risk of overlooking the recovery potential of a degraded site. So if we went out to Walker Swamp and said, it's been drained for 70 years, it's been planted to blue gums, forget about it because there's no values here that are worth protecting, we wouldn't have even thought about restoring. So somehow we've got to lift our gaze and understand that wetlands exist at a certain point in time, and there is a trajectory that's different in the future that's possible. And the earlier example we provided as well at Mount Burr Swamp showed that really neatly. You know, if you just looked at existing condition, you would have walked away from this site because there were no values to protect, but it has recovery potential. How do we measure that? At the moment, it's not being measured. This links to the second point, which is that, so how do we overcome that when at the moment all of our planning processes, the development processes attached to that focus on sending out consultants to do once-off visits, and they'll look at a site at a single point in time, take some biological observations, and that will be the defining moment as to whether we do anything with the site. It's an extremely blinkered view when it comes to wetlands. Now, if you think, why would I say that? Well, think about short-term drivers. So did you go and visit that site, as I suspect happened at Craigieburn, in the middle of the Millennium Drought? And if you did, you probably found a completely bone dry paddock that looked like it had no values. Now, if you went back after 2010-11, after a wet spell, you probably would have found values. Too late, it's gone. You know, we've now filled it in and covered it with houses. So unless we pick up those short-term changes that are even just in response to climate, which is a massive one with wetlands, let alone artificial changes, you know, we run the risk of not seeing the bigger picture. The bigger picture over time, as we've discussed with the previous examples, is driven by things we've done to the landscape. Now, that's a massive consideration. Again, if we never intend to fix anything, then we're just going to write everything off. It doesn't matter. But if we want to try and actually, as the planning system talks about, I could show you example after example all the way through the planning scheme where it talks about working with historic floodplains, re-engaging them, restoring wetlands, improving water retention. It's all there, but for some reason, the way our systems are working don't pick up on that potential and inject it into the plans. So it's leaving us with this massive blind spot in the long term. Now, a site that I'll use as an example where there's an opportunity to do this differently, where the horse hasn't bolted yet, is a place called Cunningham Swamp. This is, as you can see, on the edge of Melbourne's outer urban growth edge, down at Point Cook. But if you go there and you look at this site at a single point in time, you might produce a map that looks something like that, where there's areas of permanent water, there's different types of wetland vegetation. Now, if you look closely at that, you'll notice how those areas all seem to correspond to these drain and levee features. So the ecology that is now present at this site and the water regime has adapted to suit what's there. Now, if we look at the LiDAR imagery, you can see that some of that is driven also by physical changes to the surface. So we've dug deep holes out there and we're ponding water or whatever, like some of that is driven by that. But much of it is driven by the levees and the drains. So you'll see there's this overlap between how we've set the site up to function in its developed state to facilitate agriculture, and that flows on to then, if you're lucky enough to go out there after a wet year, you'll see values. Those values are responding to all these changes that we've made. The danger is a consultant goes out there, they find those values. Some of them might look like they're really important, but we want to wrap them up in cotton wool and say, let's not change anything. Now, the danger here is that you lock in a site that's already gone through massive modification in its modified state. And that would be missing the bigger picture again. That's just one example. The other thing that goes on at a site when you drain it, and large parts of Cunningham Swamp are now artificially drier than they should be. Some are wetter, some parts are wetter, but some are drier. That process of terrestrialization I mentioned earlier occurs. So simply put, you know, in the presence of grazing, you end up with quite open areas that are dominated by pasture species, and the wetland plants will creep down slope because the site's got drier. In the context to the right, where you see a more of a national park situation, they just shrub up or they become, you know, dominated by the edge species. So that's the process we talked about earlier. Now, if you looked at Cunningham Swamp with a fresh set of eyes and filled in all the drains and the levee banks, that's the zones you could recreate. You could actually reverse that process, and you could have the plants rearrange themselves at that site and create zonation that corresponds with the depths of inundation radiating out from the deep to the shallow. Much like that appears, which is a very different view to this view, the bottom left, where you've got a site that's a bit of a piecemeal because there's levee banks and drains and all sorts through it. The third item is this focus on a limited set of values under specific legislation. Now, I'm thinking the EPBC Act, it's been great for shining a light on particular species, and in the case of Melbourne, on seasonal herbaceous wetlands as a specific ecological community. But there's a downside, and the downside is that by focusing so heavily on just a small set of values, we're quite often forgetting everything else. And there is a lot of everything else. In fact, that's where most of our biodiversity exists, is outside of that very small list of things that we keep prioritizing because someone decided to put them up to be listed as a nationally threatened species. So I'm not saying we don't need that. I'm saying it needs to be taken in context. There's a wider view here that we're often missing. Existing corporate data sets are problematic. And as we all know, you guys will know better than anyone, being academic, many of you linked to, you know, academic research, is that there are so many data gaps out there. And there are all sorts of reasons why we don't have complete coverage of knowledge. In Melbourne's outer urban growth zone, the fact that most of it's private land is a key reason why we don't have very much knowledge about these areas, because they just haven't been surveyed. When the survey comes along, we're taking a chance with timing, as we mentioned earlier, about the effect of climate and modification. So I'll show you a couple of maps of this area around Rowan, which is a really good case study for illustrating the last couple of points about values and data sets. Now, if we were to show you existing conditions, this is what you see if you just go to the existing data sets. You see sections of natural creeks or semi-natural creeks marked in blue, a big network of drains marked in red, wetlands, in inverted commas, that are mapped in orange there. Now, they're an odd shape for a reason. One of the reasons is the location of that urban growth zone boundary, and the fact that surveys in the swamp to the right, Hern Swamp, were only done south of that line initially. And then only areas that met the classification for seasonal herbaceous wetlands were actually marked and mapped up. So interestingly, Hannah Swamp, or Burrung Bullock to the left, that is a more accurate representation of the feature as a geomorphic feature, which is interesting. So there's these quirks in the mapping that are inconsistent. But do we take that view, or do we take that view? So this is a view of this very same landscape that Glenelg Trust has put together based on the historic information of where the waterways used to be and where the wetland extent used to be. It's a very different view. In terms of existing drainage and wetland layers, like we've just looked at, so this issue of what are we at risk of missing if we just turn on the DELP layers for these things? Well, are you confident you're looking at where the waterways used to be? Because I'm not, having looked at this a lot. They're often drainage layers rather than genuine natural waterway layers. And as a result of that, there's a flow-on effect. How confident are we when that layer is then used by planners to determine where we should go looking and engaging traditional owners to go looking for traditional cultural heritage? Are they even looking in the right places? Because if you're a First Nations person looking for evidence of past occupation, you don't walk along a drain through the middle of a drain swamp. You want to be walking around the bank of that swamp. It's a pretty obvious thing if you stop and think about it. But at the moment, we're sending people down the wrong path potentially. In terms of what that mapping looks like, so here's an example of the Burrung-Bullock Hannah Swamp site. This is what you see if you go into the DELP mapping layers and where the waterways supposedly are based on artificial drainage. Interestingly, Melbourne Water, and this is evolving, but as of a couple of years ago, the DSS at that time was proposing to modify that further and create waterways in those locations to facilitate development, urban development. As you'll see at that point, no recognition of the swamp. And then you compare that to our vision for that landscape, which actually remembers where these wetlands are and were and could be again, and where the waterways were and could be again. And it's a very different view, as you can see. And as I mentioned before about cultural heritage, so there's some work going on at the moment looking at options for creating a regional park in this area. And this is work that DELPA are doing. And, there's some really positive discussion and signs. It'll be interesting to see where it lands. But at the moment, the wetland features are being spoken about as a potential part of this regional park vision. But interestingly, as you'll see there, that blue hatched line shows you that the cultural heritage sensitivity layer has been snapped to the artificial waterways, which is a bit of it's at risk of missing the full picture. And to their credit, we're providing feedback on this as others are, because it's just gone out for comment, public comment to groups like ours. We've provided back this view as an alternative view for where the cultural heritage in that landscape is most likely to be found based on where the wetland banks originally were and where the waterways originally were. So it's a very different view. Right, so while we're talking about mapping, artificial straight lines of demarcation are a big issue. And the blind spot this creates is, what do you do when you've got wetlands that straddle those lines? So just very quickly, again, that old urban growth zone boundary, which had a flow-on effect for the way things have been defined and mapped. And further, that one view that you're looking at there straddles 6 different PSPs, which means that all those wetland features, well, I should put it this way, none of those 3 wetland features are embedded within a single PSP. So how do we coordinate planning for those features, their hydrological requirements, their restoration vision, working with private landowners who own the areas that are being proposed for development? This is really hard stuff to get right. Last couple. So yeah, another barrier is that because we're plugging these ideas of development outer urban Melbourne into a system that's very used to building everything that it wants, including asking engineers to design and build them their wetlands, we're often overlooking the opportunity to utilise natural features, which if you stop and think about it, it makes a lot more sense, because these are areas that are low points in the landscape. They're already connected into waterways. We could potentially recover them. The downside is the natural wetlands tend to be less space efficient. So there's a tension here between people trying to maximise developable area and utilising these features. And the final one, which is actually probably one of the biggest ones, which is this dilemma of the way we do things and workplace culture. And the system is definitely biased by this at the moment, because we all carry our history with us. And if we've got comfortable and used to doing things a certain way, this is very hard to shake off. So big systems like the development system and the planning system, this is a genuine issue, because there's different ways we could be thinking, smarter outcomes we could be achieving, working across boundaries. The plans all say we should be doing this, but the reality of implementing that is very difficult when you've got people sitting in their different areas and who are used to doing things a certain way. So just a few concluding remarks, because I know we're just about out of time. As you've probably gathered, to get better results here, we have to pay attention, because the system isn't just going to get it right all by itself. There's gaps and pitfalls everywhere. And I think everybody tuning in today can play a role in this, because, you know, there'll be places that you're aware of and issues you'll be aware of that are at risk of being overlooked. I think I've already talked about the danger of business as usual, that cultural issue. This is something that you know, we all need to lift our game, all of us collectively. You know, we can do better than business as usual. Part of that is breaking down barriers and working across the silos that it's just inevitable that they develop. And we can all think of times and I think in the past where we would have seen that this works really well when you've got people who are really lifting their gaze and working across those barriers, and probably also times where we can see that something was really done not so well because that didn't happen. In terms of how we look at sites, you know, as you probably gathered, our recommendation is do your homework, take the time, get to know it, investigate the history, and really try and stop and understand and think through this idea of trajectory of change over time, because it is a massive issue. And with wetlands, they don't stay still. Let's not kid ourselves. They're always changing anyway. So this is, if you're not doing that, you're not really doing the wetland justice. Linked to that is the fact that, you know, as science trained people, and I came out of my science training with a hesitation to change things. So I understand where that comes from. You know, a world that's been full of all this change and we don't want to change things. But when you see all this change that's been caused by previous people trying to dry a wetland out, the only way to fix it is to make change ourselves. And being prepared to do so is incredibly important. You just have to show faith in the wetlands, because we know that wetlands respond to changing conditions, and we have now got this portfolio of sites where we can demonstrate time and time again that a system will self-correct and plants will move to where they need to be in the elevation gradient, and the biota will move and things do work out. There may be a period of flux and change. You just have to be prepared to ride that out. And the other thing that I would really ask people to remember, particularly around the urban growth zone around Melbourne, is it doesn't matter if it doesn't look perfect straight away, because once you've set a site aside, you've got all the time in the world. But once you've locked a site up for development and it's no longer open space, it is now gone for all time. So this is, you know, getting the decision right at that first fork in the road at the planning stage is so critical, because groups like the Friends of Merry Creek are a great example of where they've gone back and worked on waterways that were set aside decades ago and been able to restore values, biodiversity values, significant values decades later. If the land had never been set aside, those outcomes were not possible. Now, in this case, with wetlands, we have the advantage that water will do most of the work for us. But also getting our mind around the fact that there's no fixed point here, no end point. It's not like signing off the building development and saying, right, job's done, we move on. Nature is always changing, and we need to be able to accommodate that. With that in mind, that photo you can see there is a before and after of one of the first major wetland restoration projects I worked on many years ago. And you can see the before image, my boys walking across as the site filled with water for the first time after 40 years of drainage. That's the same site, a photo taken 15 years later, last year, just to show you the habitat complexity. If we're patient, that will form. It's now a fantastic site and part of a Ramsar site, actually, that wetland as well. So on that point, I will stop because I realise I'm just about out of time, but thank you very much for listening. And yeah, I hope that that's been of interest to everybody.